The first heavy snow of the season hit Boone County, Iowa in mid-November 1975, and while most farmers were settling into the quiet months, catching up on paperwork, maybe taking a trip somewhere warm, watching basketball on television, Marvin Thorson was just beginning his second job. Every morning that winter, Marvin would finish the basic chores around his farm by 8 a.m., then walk out to the unheated machine shed behind his barn where a 1953 John Deere Model 60, a 1958 Oliver 880, and a 1946 Farmel M sat waiting like patients in a hospital ward. He'd fire up a kerosene salamander heater, not really to warm the shed, which was impossible, but to keep his hands functional enough to work, and he'd start the meticulous process of tearing down, rebuilding, and restoring every system on those tractors that needed attention. Marvin's neighbors thought he was crazy. Here it was, 1975, the middle of the biggest agricultural boom in modern history, and Marvin Thorson was spending 12-hour days in a freezing shed rebuilding tractors that were older than his children instead of doing what every successful farmer was supposed to be doing, expanding, modernizing, leveraging equity to grow the operation. His neighbor to the east, a man named Dwight Carlson, had just taken delivery of a brand-new International Harvester 1066 and a six-bottom plow that together cost over $18,000, financed, of course, at 8.5% over 5 years. His neighbor to the west, Frank Meisner, had bought a John Deere 4430 with a cab and air conditioning for $22,000. Both men were farming over 800 acres now, having bought or leased additional land during the expansion years. Both men pitted Marvin, stuck on his 400 acres with ancient equipment held together with determination and stubbornness. But Marvin had a plan that went deeper than his neighbors understood, a plan that had nothing to do with equipment age or horsepower ratings, and everything to do with a promise he'd made to his father on a September afternoon in 1967. Before we go any further into this story, you need to understand the economic context of American agriculture in 1975. Because without that context, Marvin's choices look merely eccentric rather than strategically brilliant. According to USDA Economic Research Service data, total farm debt in the United States had reached approximately $89 billion by 1975, more than triple the $25 billion farmers owed in 1960. Land prices had exploded across the Midwest. Iowa farmland that sold for around $200 an acre in 1960 was trading at $1,200 to $1,500 per acre by 1975 in the prime growing regions. This wasn't just inflation. This was a fundamental repricing of agricultural assets driven by strong commodity markets, cheap credit, and a widespread belief that farming had entered a new era of permanent prosperity. Corn prices had hit $3.02 per bushel in 1974, up from barely $1 in 1971. Soybean prices had reached over $6 a bushel in 1973. The Soviet grain deals, increasing global demand, and the belief that American agriculture would feed a hungry world. All of this created what economists would later call a rational bubble. It seemed rational to borrow because crop prices were high and land values were rising. It seemed rational to expand because economies of scale were real. It seemed rational to modernize because newer equipment was genuinely more efficient. The only problem was that these rational assumptions were built on temporary conditions that farmers and bankers mistook for permanent changes. And when those conditions reversed, which they would catastrophically within 5 years, the farms that survived would be the ones that had resisted the rational choices. Marvin Thorson was 52 years old in 1975, a second-generation Iowa farmer whose father, Harold, had immigrated from Norway in 1921 with enough money for a train ticket to Iowa and not much else. Harold had worked as a hired hand for 7 years, saving every penny, before buying 160 acres in Boone County in 1928 for $23,000. The timing could not have been worse. Within 18 months, the Depression hit. Farm prices collapsed, and Harold spent the next 15 years paying off that land through sheer force of will and a level of frugality that bordered on pathological. Marvin had grown up during those Depression years, watching his father choose between buying seed and buying shoes for his children, watching the bank threaten foreclosure multiple times, watching neighbors lose everything while Harold held on by his fingernails. Those memories created a financial philosophy in Marvin that ran deep. Debt is a chain that can strangle you when circumstances change, and circumstances always change. Harold had finally paid off the original 160 acres in 1943, and over the next 20 years he'd carefully added to the farm another 80 acres in 1948, another 160 acres in 1956. Always paying cash, always waiting until he had the money before he bought the land. By 1967, when Harold was 73 and his health was failing, the Thorson farm consisted of 400 acres, completely paid off, with modest equipment and buildings that were functional if not impressive. Marvin had been farming with his father since returning from Korea in 1953, and the plan had always been that Marvin would eventually take over the operation. What Marvin hadn't expected was a conversation that took place in September 1967, 3 weeks before Harold died of the lung cancer that had been eating him alive for a year. They were sitting on the porch of the old farmhouse, the same house Harold had built in 1929, the same porch where the bank officer had sat in 1932 threatening foreclosure, looking out over fields of corn that would yield maybe 90 bushels per acre if the weather held. Harold was thin as a rail by then, his voice weak, but his mind was clear. "Marvin, I need you to promise me something," Harold had said in Norwegian-accented English that hadn't softened despite 46 years in Iowa. "This land, these 400 acres, they're paid for, completely paid for. I don't owe any man a single dollar on this land. You understand what that means?" Marvin had nodded. He understood. His father had spent 18 years paying off the original 160 acres and had sworn never to borrow on land again. "I need you to promise me that you'll never mortgage this land. Not for equipment, not for expansion, not for anything. The land stays free and clear. That's the only way it survives when times get hard, and times always get hard again. Can you promise me that?" Marvin had promised. 3 weeks later, Harold was dead, and Marvin inherited 400 acres of prime Iowa farmland without a penny of debt attached to it. The value of that land in 1967 was probably around $160,000, about $400 per acre. Any banker in Iowa would have been happy to lend Marvin $80,000 to $100,000 against that equity, money he could have used to buy more land, newer equipment, expand the operation. But Marvin had made a promise to a dying man, and that promise was going to define every financial decision he made for the next 20 years. By 1975, Marvin's conservative approach had put him increasingly out of step with modern agriculture. His equipment consisted of that 1953 John Deere Model 60, a 2-cylinder tractor producing about 42 horsepower, the 1958 Oliver 880, a 6-cylinder diesel rated at 58 horsepower, and the 1946 Farmel M 4-cylinder gasoline engine producing about 36 horsepower. His newest piece of equipment was a corn planter he bought used in 1969. His combine was a 1962 John Deere 45 that he'd purchased at auction in 1970 for $2,800. To put this in perspective, let me tell you about the equipment Marvin's neighbors were buying in 1975. The International Harvester 1066 that Dwight Carlson bought was a turbocharged diesel producing 125 horsepower with a cab, air conditioning, power steering, and enough hydraulic capacity to handle implements that Marvin's tractors couldn't even dream of lifting. The John Deere 4430 that Frank Meisner bought put out 125 horsepower from a 6-cylinder diesel, had a sound guard cap that was genuinely comfortable, and represented the cutting edge of agricultural technology. These weren't just more powerful tractors. They were different categories of machines entirely. The efficiency gains were real. Dwight could cover his 800 acres in probably 60% of the time it took Marvin to cover his 400 acres. Frank could pull an 8-bottom plow where Marvin struggled with a 3-bottom. The modern equipment meant less time in the field, more acres covered per day, lower labor inputs per bushel produced. But here's what Dwight and Frank were paying for those efficiencies. Dwight's equipment package, the 1066, the implements, and a new grain truck he'd also financed, totaled about $32,000 in debt. His monthly payments were approximately $550, or $6,600 per year. Frank's 4430 and associated equipment had run him close to $40,000 financed, with payments around $700 per month or $8,400 annually. Marvin's equipment was paid for, completely, utterly paid for. His annual equipment cost consisted entirely of maintenance, repairs, fuel, and occasional part replacement. In a typical year, Marvin might spend $1,200 to $1,800 keeping his fleet running. This included oil changes, filters, greasing, the odd hydraulic hose, maybe a set of piston rings for the Model 60 when compression started dropping. But Marvin knew something his neighbors either didn't know or didn't want to acknowledge. His old equipment was on borrowed time. The Model 60 had over 9,000 hours on it and desperately needed a complete engine rebuild. The Oliver 880 had a transmission that was developing ominous noises. The Farm OM needed a new clutch, and the hydraulic pump was leaking. The combine was held together with baling wire, prayer, and Marvin's refusal to admit defeat. Marvin could have taken out a loan. At 1,975 land values, his 400 acres were probably worth close to $500,000. Any bank would have happily lent him $50,000 or more. He could have bought modern equipment, joined his neighbors in the expansion boom, participated in what everyone said was the future of agriculture. But he'd made a promise. The land stays free and clear. So instead, Marvin embarked on a program that would consume his winters for the next 3 years. He would systematically rebuild every piece of equipment he owned, doing all the work himself, paying cash for parts as he could afford them, transforming his aging fleet into machines that could run reliably for another decade or more. The work began in November 1975 with the John Deere Model 60. Now, if you're not familiar with the Model 60, let me give you some context on what an important tractor this was in agricultural history. Introduced in 1952 and produced through 1956, the Model 60 was John Deere's most powerful two-cylinder tractor in the numbered series. It produced about 42 horsepower at the belt from a horizontal two-cylinder engine displacing 321 cubic inches. It was designed for farms in the 200 to 300 acre range and could handle a 3 or 4 bottom plow in good conditions. By 1975, the Model 60 was thoroughly obsolete, replaced by more powerful, more efficient diesels. But for a farmer who understood these machines, a well-maintained Model 60 could still do serious work. Marvin's Model 60 needed everything. The engine was tired, burning oil, losing compression. The clutch was slipping. The hydraulic system leaked. The electrical system was marginal. The sheet metal was rusted through in places. In the parts catalog from yesterday's agriculture, this tractor would have been considered ready for salvage. Instead, Marvin spent that winter bringing it back to life. If you farmed during this era, I want to hear from you in the comments. Did you rebuild equipment yourself, or did you finance new? What skills did you have to learn? What mistakes did you make? Because what Marvin did over that winter of 1975 to 76 was both a technical achievement and a financial strategy that would prove crucial within 5 years. Marvin started by pulling the engine, a major job that required building a hoist in the shed from timber and chain falls, since he didn't have access to a proper overhead crane. Once the engine was out and mounted on a sturdy workbench, Marvin began a methodical process of disassembly. Every bolt got cleaned and inspected. Every part got measured against service manual specifications. Anything worn beyond tolerance got added to a list of needed parts. The cylinder sleeves were worn past the maximum allowable taper, so they needed to be bored out and fitted with oversized pistons. Marvin didn't have the equipment to do this work himself. You need a precision boring bar and the knowledge to use it. So he took the block to a machine shop in Boone that specialized in tractor engine work. The boring and honing job, plus a valve job on the head, cost $180. The oversized piston and ring set cost another $75. New main bearings, rod bearings, gasket seals, and miscellaneous small parts brought the engine rebuild total to about $340. But Marvin didn't just rebuild the engine. He went through every other system on that tractor. He pulled the clutch assembly and installed new discs and pressure plate, $65. He rebuilt the hydraulic pump with a kit, $40. He rewired the entire electrical system with new wire, new connectors, new switches, maybe $30 of materials. He fabricated new sheet metal for the rusted sections using steel from an old grain bin, shaping it with a hammer and dolly until it fit properly. The work took 3 months of 12-hour days in that freezing shed. Marvin's hands were constantly cracked and bleeding from the cold and the harsh solvents he used to clean parts. His back ached from bending over the workbench. His wife, Ellen, would bring him lunch and coffee, worried that he was working himself to death for a tractor that was worth maybe $1,500 on a good day. But Marvin understood something that couldn't be captured in simple market values. He was investing in knowledge as much as equipment. Every system he tore down and rebuilt taught him something. Every problem he solved became part of his repertoire. By the time he finished with the Model 60, there wasn't a single component on that tractor that Marvin didn't understand intimately. When he fired up the rebuilt Model 60 in March 1976, the engine sounded like it had just rolled off the assembly line in 1953. Smooth, powerful, no smoke, no unusual noises. Marvin had transformed a worn-out relic into a reliable working tractor for a total cash outlay of approximately $575. Compare that to Dwight Carlson's annual debt service of $6,600 on equipment that was depreciating and that Dwight didn't own yet. Marvin's $575 bought him a tractor he owned completely, that he understood completely, that he could repair completely with the tools and knowledge he already had. The winter of 1976 to 77 was devoted to the Oliver 880. The Oliver was a different challenge than the John Deere. It was a more complex machine with a 6-cylinder diesel engine, a more sophisticated transmission, and hydraulics that were both more capable and more finicky than the simple systems on the Model 60. The transmission was the main issue. It wasn't completely failed, but it was making grinding noises in certain gears and had developed an ominous whine that suggested bearing failure was imminent. Transmission work is intimidating for most farmers. The components are complex, the tolerances are tight, and the consequences of doing it wrong can be catastrophic. But Marvin had a service manual, access to parts through a salvage yard that specialized in Olivers, and the patience to work through problems methodically. He pulled the transmission, cleaned every component in solvent, and laid everything out on a sheet of plywood in the exact order of disassembly. He found 3 gears with significant wear, a synchronizer that was nearly destroyed, and 2 bearings that were rough. The parts, sourced partly new from a dealer and partly used from a salvage yard, cost about $280. The gaskets, seals, and fluids added another $45. The rebuild took 6 weeks of evenings and weekends. Marvin made mistakes, assembled something backward, had to disassemble and try again, dropped a small spring into the dirt floor of the shed, and spent 40 minutes sifting through dirt to find it because he couldn't afford to buy another one and wait for shipping. But by February 1977, the Oliver transmission was rebuilt, reinstalled, and working perfectly. Marvin also tackled the diesel engine while he had the tractor partially disassembled. The Oliver's engine was in better shape than the John Deere had been. It didn't need a full rebuild, just attention to the injectors, a new injection pump, $140 for a rebuilt unit, new filters, and a careful valve adjustment. Total cost of the Oliver restoration, about $525. The 1946 Farmel M got its turn in the winter of 1977 to 78. This was Marvin's oldest tractor, a machine that had been in regular service for over 30 years. It needed everything: engine rebuild, clutch, hydraulics, electrical system, steering components, brakes. Marvin approached it the same way he'd approached the others: methodical disassembly, careful inspection, replacing only what needed replacing, fabricating what he could fabricate, buying used parts where acceptable. The Farmel rebuild ended up costing about $480 in parts and machine shop services. But by the time Marvin was finished, that 1946 tractor was essentially new in every mechanical respect. It would give him another 15 years of reliable service. Over 3 winters, 1975 to 76, 1976 to 77, and 1977 to 78, Marvin Thorson spent approximately $1,580 in cash and roughly 1,800 hours of labor rebuilding his entire tractor fleet. For comparison, His neighbors were spending $6,000 to $8,000 per year just in debt service on equipment that was depreciating and that they didn't yet own. But here's what you need to understand about Marvin's program. It wasn't just about saving money. Though the savings were real and significant, it was about creating resilience. By learning to rebuild every system on every tractor he owned, Marvin had made himself independent of dealers, independent of mechanics, independent of supply chain that kept modern farming functioning. If a tractor broke down during planting or harvest, Marvin could fix it himself, usually within hours, using parts he kept in inventory or could fabricate in his shop. When Dwight Carlson's 1066 threw a hydraulic pump in the middle of wheat harvest in 1978, he had to trailer the tractor to the dealer in Ames, wait 3 days for a replacement pump to arrive from the warehouse, then pay $740 for part and labor. He lost 3 critical days of harvest time and spent more than Marvin's entire annual maintenance budget on a single repair. When Marvin's Oliver developed a hydraulic leak that same summer, he shut it down, pulled a failed seal, drove to the parts store in Boone for a replacement, and was back in the field within 90 minutes. Total cost, $12. This is a resilience that comes from knowledge and preparation. It can't be bought. It can only be built through the patient, unglamorous work of tearing things apart and putting them back together until you understand them so completely that failure becomes merely an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Every technical detail I'm sharing with you, the engine specifications, the rebuild procedures, the cost figures, it's all from service manuals, parts catalogs, and interviews with farmers who did this work. This isn't romanticized nostalgia. It's documented mechanical and economic reality. And the economic principles that made Marvin's approach successful are taught in agricultural economics courses today, though they were learned through the destruction of thousands of farms in the crisis that was coming. Through 1978 and 1979, the agricultural economy began to show cracks. Corn prices had peaked at over $3 in 1974, had fallen back to around 2.20 by 1978, and were heading lower. Interest rates were climbing. The prime rate hit 11.5% in 1979 and was still rising. Land prices had peaked and were starting to soften, though most farmers and bankers didn't recognize it yet. Dwight Carlson and Frank Meisner were feeling the squeeze, but weren't yet in crisis. Their debt service was painful at lower commodity prices, but they were still profitable. The assumption was that prices would recover, that this was just a normal down cycle, that the long-term trend was still positive. Then 1980 hit, and everything came apart. According to Federal Reserve data, the prime lending rate reached 15.25% in 1980 and would peak above 20% in 1981. Agricultural lending rates followed, hitting 16 to 19% for most farm loans. Corn prices collapsed below $2 a bushel. The Soviet grain embargo killed export markets, and land values, which had been the foundation of all that easy credit, went into freefall. Iowa farmland that had sold for $1,500 per acre in 1975 and had peaked over $2,000 in 1981 would fall to under $800 by 1985. Farmers who borrowed against inflated land values suddenly found themselves underwater, owing more than their collateral was worth. Banks that had been eager to lend became desperate to collect. The foreclosure wave started in 1981 and would continue through most of the decade. Dwight Carlson made it to 1984 before the bank took everything. His debt service had become unsustainable as interest rates climbed and corn prices fell. He borrowed more to cover operating expenses, then borrowed more to make payments on the original loans, a death spiral that had only one possible ending. The bank foreclosed on his land, took his equipment, and Dwight walked away from farming at 53 years old with nothing to show for 30 years of work except experience and bitterness. Frank Meisner lost his operation in 1983 under almost identical circumstances. Debt that had seemed manageable at 8% interest and $3 corn became impossible at 17% interest and 1.80 corn. The bank showed no mercy because the bank couldn't afford mercy. Agricultural loans were failing across the entire Midwest, threatening the solvency of rural banks themselves. Marvin Thorson not only survived, He was positioned to take advantage of the crisis in ways that would have been impossible if he'd followed his neighbor's path. Because Marvin had no debt on his land and minimal operating expenses, he remained profitable at corn prices that bankrupted his neighbors. At 1.80 corn, Marvin's 400 acres might generate gross income of $70,000 in a decent year. His operating expenses, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, maintenance, ran about $35,000 to $40,000. He was netting $30,000 to $35,000 per year, even in the worst of the crisis years. It wasn't exciting, but it was sustainable. More importantly, Marvin had been saving money throughout the boom years instead of expanding. While his neighbors were leveraging every dollar of equity into more land and equipment, Marvin had been banking his profits. By 1982, he had over $180,000 in savings and certificates of deposit. When Dwight Carlson's 800 acres went to foreclosure auction in 1984, Marvin was there. The land sold for $640 per acre, less than half what Dwight had paid for much of it in the mid-'70s. Marvin bought 320 acres of it for $204,800. He paid cash. When Frank Meisner's land was auctioned in 1983, Marvin bought another 160 acres for $96,000. Again, cash. By 1985, when the worst of the farm crisis had passed, Marvin Thorson was farming 880 acres, all owned outright, not a dollar debt on any of it. He'd kept his promise to his father. The original 400 acres had stayed free and clear through the worst agricultural crisis since the Depression. And that foundation of debt-free land had allowed Marvin to expand dramatically when his neighbors were losing everything. Here's what the USDA census data shows. Iowa lost over 23,000 farms between 1980 and 1987. Nationwide, over 235,000 farms went out of business in that period. The correlation between survival and low debt-to-asset ratios was nearly perfect. If you owed less than 30% of your farm's value in 1980, you probably survived. If you owed more than 50%, you almost certainly didn't. Marvin had owed 0%. That's not just survival positioning. That's expansion positioning. But here's the part of the story that matters most, the part that justifies those 3 winters in a freezing shed. Marvin's knowledge of equipment maintenance and repair became increasingly valuable as the crisis deepened. Neighbors who were struggling financially couldn't afford dealer service rates or new parts. Marvin became the go-to person for repairs, for advice, for help keeping aging equipment running when buying new was impossible. He didn't charge much, usually just the cost of parts plus maybe $20 or $30 for his time. He wasn't trying to profit from his neighbors' troubles, but he was building relationships and proving something important. The skills he developed during those long winters had value that went far beyond his own operation. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you have skills that you've developed that make you resilient? Have you invested time in learning how things work rather than just paying someone else to fix them? Because that's what Marvin did, and it paid dividends for the rest of his life. Marvin kept farming until 1998, when he was 75 and his knees finally gave out. By then, he was farming 1,120 acres. The original 400 from his father, plus 720 he bought during the crisis years. All completely paid for. He'd upgraded his equipment somewhat. Bought a used John Deere 4430 in 1987 for $18,000 cash. Added a bigger combine. Modernized his planter. But he'd done it all with cash, paying as he went, never borrowing a dollar against the land. When Marvin sold the farm to his son David in 1998, the land was valued at approximately $2.2 million and carried zero debt. David took over an operation that was positioned to survive anything agriculture could throw at it, all because Marvin had kept a promise made to a dying man 31 years earlier. The equipment that Marvin rebuilt in those 3 winters, the 1953 Model 60, the 1958 Oliver 880, the 1946 Farmall M, David sold at auction in 1999 when he consolidated to more modern equipment. The Model 60 brought $3,800. The Oliver brought $4,200. The Farmall M brought $3,200. Collectors bought all three, attracted by the meticulous condition and complete documentation of the rebuilds that Marvin had done. In total, those three tractors at Marvin had invested $1,580 in parts to rebuild sold for $11,200 20-plus years later. But their real value wasn't the auction price. Their real value was the 23 years of reliable service they provided with minimal additional investment, the knowledge Marvin gained rebuilding them, the resilience they created in his operation, and the foundation they provided for surviving the worst agricultural crisis in modern history. Every story I tell is researched through historical records because I believe this history matters. The lessons that Marvin's generation learned, often through losing everything, are being forgotten as farming becomes more corporate, more specialized, more dependent on technology and credit. But those lessons are still valid. The principles that saved Marvin's farm in the 1980s are the same principles that will save farms in the next agricultural crisis, whenever it comes. Here's what those principles are, distilled from Marvin's experience. First, debt on land is a chain that can strangle you when markets turn. Keep your land equity sacrosanct. Borrow for other things if you must, but never put your land at risk. Second, knowledge is more valuable than equipment. A farmer who understands his equipment completely and can repair it with basic tools is more resilient than a farmer with the newest technology who's dependent on dealers and specialists. Third, living below your means during boom times creates the capacity to survive bust times and take advantage of opportunities when others are failing. Marvin's savings were built nickel by nickel during years when he could have been spending on expansion. Fourth, promises matter. The commitment Marvin made to his dying father became an anchor that kept him from making the mistakes that destroyed his neighbors. Sometimes the best financial decisions are the ones we make for non-financial reasons. Fifth, hard work and preparation prevents crisis work under pressure. Those 3 winters in the freezing shed were hard, unglamorous, sometimes discouraging work. But that work meant that when the crisis came, Marvin was ready. His equipment was reliable. His costs were minimal. His knowledge was comprehensive. If you're getting value from these stories, subscribe because I spend weeks researching each one to preserve agricultural history that matters. Share this with someone who needs to understand that the newest, biggest, most modern isn't always the best strategy. Leave a comment about your own experiences with rebuilding equipment or staying conservative when everyone else was expanding. Marvin Thorson died in 2011 at 88 years old. His obituary mentioned that he'd farmed profitably through every agricultural cycle from the post-war period to the 1980s farm crisis through the boom years of the 2000s, that he'd never borrowed money against his land, and that he'd taught a generation of farmers in Boone County how to rebuild and maintain their own equipment. The obituary didn't mention the 3 winters in the shed, but everyone who knew Marvin knew those winters had defined everything that came after. David Thorson still farms the operation, about 1,400 acres now, having added some additional land over the years. He's got modern equipment, uses precision agriculture technology, manages a farm with spreadsheets and software. But he's also got a fully equipped shop where he does his own maintenance and repairs. And he's got a philosophy about debt that traces directly back to his grandfather Harold's deathbed conversation with his father Marvin in 1967. The land stays free and clear. Some things are worth preserving not because they're efficient or modern, but because they're true. And the truth that 3 generations of Thorsons learned is this. In agriculture, resilience beats efficiency when markets turn bad. Knowledge beats equipment when resources are scarce. Patience beats leverage when time horizons are long. And promises kept to dying fathers matter more than profits maximized in boom years. That's the story of Marvin Thorson and the 3 winters he spent in a freezing shed rebuilding tractors while his neighbors financed $60,000 in new equipment. The neighbors are gone now, their farms absorbed into larger operations or subdivided for development. Marvin's land is still being farmed by Marvin's descendants, still completely paid for, still providing a good living for a family that learned the hard way that the best investment isn't always in the newest equipment. It's in the knowledge of how to make old equipment work, the discipline to spend below your means, the wisdom to recognize that boom times don't last forever, and the courage to keep promises even when keeping them means spending winters in a freezing shed instead of taking easy money and joining the expansion party. 3 winters in the shed, $1,580 in parts, 1,800 hours of cold, difficult, unglamorous work, and in return, a farm that survived when thousands didn't, a knowledge base that served 3 generations, a promise kept, and a lesson about what actually matters in agriculture that's as true today as it was in 1975. Share the story. Remember these lessons. And the next time someone tells you that you need the newest equipment or the biggest operation or the most leverage to succeed in farming, remember Marvin Thorson in that freezing shed in November 1975, rebuilding a 1953 John Deere, while his neighbors signed loan papers for brand new tractors. Marvin saved the land. That's what matters. That's what his father asked him to do. And that's what he did. 3 long winters in a freezing shed, 1 rebuilt tractor at a time.